really killed the lighthouse keeper? A Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. Fog over Dunmorrow Point. The village of Dunmorrow sat at the very edge, England, where the land grew weary of itself and surrendered to the grey Atlantic in a series of broken cliffs and sharp granite outcroppings. It was not a place one visited by accident. The road that wound down to it from the market town of Polwydden was a single-track affair, lined on both sides by walls of blackthorn so ancient and interlocked that driving through them in the evening felt, one local farmer once remarked, passing through the ribs of some vast dead animal. The lighthouse stood a quarter-mile beyond the village proper, upon a promontory called Dunmorrow Point. It rose 70 feet above the sea in a column of whitewashed stone that had been repainted, according to the brass plaque inside its door, in 1887 and again in 1923. Light itself, a magnificent Fresnel lens of the dioptric variety, was said by mariners familiar with the Cornish coast to be the clearest and reliable beacon between Land's End and the Bristol Channel. Edmund Caswell had been its keeper for 19 years. He had come to the position in 1924, following 12 years of service in the Merchant Navy and a period of private employment, the exact nature of which remained to the villagers of Dunmorrow something of a mystery. He was a man of 61, broad-shouldered and tanned to the texture of old leather, with a white moustache that he trimmed precisely every Sunday morning, and eyes of a peculiar pale grey that seemed to collect light rather than reflect it. He was not, by any general account, a beloved man. He was respected. There is a difference, and in small coastal communities it is a distinction keenly felt. He performed his duties without fault. The light had not failed on his watch. He paid his bills promptly. He attended St. Cuthbert's on alternate Sundays, spoke to no one before the service, and to very few after it, and walked home alone along the cliff path with the purposeful stride of a man who had decided, long ago, that solitude was not a misfortune, but a preference. He had, in addition to his professional responsibilities, a small household of 4 individuals who occupied the lighthouse cottage attached to the tower. His widowed sister-in-law, Mrs. Vera Caswell, who had arrived 8 months prior, following the death of his brother Reginald in London. His niece, Miss Dora Caswell, aged 24, thin and watchful young woman who painted watercolours of the sea with considerable talent and no income, and 2 servants, Mrs. Polly Treen, Cornish woman of 50, who cooked and cleaned with efficiency and very little warmth, and her husband Jack Treen, who maintained the foghorn mechanism and drove the supply van to Polwydden once a fortnight. There was, in addition, 5th presence at Dunmorrow Point during the September of 1943, in which these events occurred. Mr. Oliver Quain, London solicitor, of 47, who had arrived 3 weeks previously, ostensibly for a period of recuperation following a respiratory illness. He told Mrs. Treen upon arrival, being advised by his physician to seek fresh sea air and complete rest. He occupied the guest room above the kitchen, took his meals with the family, and spent long hours sitting in the small parlour with a glass of brandy, and on occasion leather-bound document case that he did not invite others to examine. It was on the evening of Wednesday, the 15th of September, that Edmund Caswell died. Or rather, and here the matter becomes curious from the very beginning, that is when he was found to be dead, when he actually died, and at whose hand was a question that would require the attention of the most remarkable detective in England before it could be answered with any confidence. The evening had begun unremarkably. Dinner was served at 7. Caswell had been present, taciturn as always, consuming his lamb chop with the mechanical efficiency of a man who regards meals as necessities rather than pleasures. He had drunk one glass of claret, declined the pudding, and retired from the table at 7:45, saying that he had work to attend to in the lamp room. It was his habit at the equinox to perform a thorough inspection of the lens mechanism. No one had thought anything of it. At 9:30, Jack Treen noticed from the cottage garden that the light had not illuminated. This was at first assumed to be a mechanical issue, the timer, perhaps, or the electrical connection that had been troublesome in August. But when Treen climbed the spiral staircase with his torch and pushed open the lamp room door, he found Edmund Caswell slumped against the great lens housing, quite dead, a small blue-black bruise at his right temple, and no weapon of any kind visible in the room. Fog that had been threatening all evening rolled in from the sea at exactly that moment, as if it had been waiting for its cue. Jack Treen stood in the lamp room for a full 30 seconds before he was capable of descending the stairs. Below in the cottage, Mrs. Polly Treen heard her husband call her name, in a voice she had never heard him use before, and hoped she would later tell the constable never to hear again. Chapter 2. The dead man's silence constable Arthur Poirot of the Dunmorrow sub-station was 43 years of age, possessed of a mild disposition and an excellent memory for the dates of local agricultural shows, neither of which qualities particularly equipped him for the management of a suspicious death. He arrived at Dunmorrow Point within 20 minutes of Treen's telephone call, cycling the cliff road in darkness and fog, with a determination that spoke well of his professional character, if not his physical fitness, followed. 40 minutes later, by Inspector Colin Morrow of the Polwydden Constabulary, drove down in a black Wolseley with a young sergeant named Bates and a doctor from the market town. A Dr. Prentice, recently qualified, examined the body with conscientious thoroughness and declared death to have occurred between 8 o'clock and 9:15 in the evening, caused by a single sharp blow to the right temple, consistent with a fall against a hard surface, or, equally consistent, blow from a blunt instrument, approximately 1 inch in diameter. The lamp room offered little. It was a circular space, some 12 feet in diameter, its entire centre occupied by the great lens apparatus on its rotating mechanism. The floor was clean, the brass fittings polished. There was a small wooden stool, a maintenance log on a shelf, and Edmund Caswell. The small window, normally latched from inside, was found unlatched, but Treen confirmed he had opened it himself when he first entered, believing it might be a ventilation fault, a significant detail already lost to use. Inspector Morrow, to his credit, recognised quite quickly that the lamp room could not explain everything. The bruise at the temple was too localised, too perfectly positioned to result from an accidental fall. There was no corner or edge of the housing against which a man stumbling backward would naturally strike that precise point, and the maintenance log, which Caswell kept with nautical exactitude, recorded no entry for that evening, despite the fact that Caswell had said at dinner he intended to inspect the mechanism. "He came up here," Morrow said to Sergeant Bates, turning the thought aloud, "sat down, or was standing, and received a blow to the head, or he struck his head somehow, and then whoever was with him, if anyone was, went back down those stairs, through the cottage or outside, and—" "What?" "Vanished." Bates, a sensible young man, offered the observation that no one else in the cottage claimed to have ascended the stairs that evening. Mrs. Vera Caswell had spent the evening in the sitting-room with her daughter, Dora, working at a puzzle. Oliver Quane had been in his room since 8 o'clock. He said nothing unusual. Mrs. Polly Treen had been in the kitchen until 9, when she had gone to the parlour to listen to the wireless. Jack Treen had been in the outbuilding, tending to a fouled pulley in the foghorn mechanism, until the moment he noticed the unlit lamp. That was 6 people. 4 in the cottage proper, 1 in the outbuilding, 1 now dead at the top of the tower, and no witness to anything. It was a remarkably clean arrangement, though everyone had positioned themselves with great care for exactly this contingency. The household was questioned individually. Mrs. Vera Caswell received the news of her brother-in-law's death with a stillness that might have been shock or might have been something else. It was difficult to say. She was a handsome woman of 52, dark-haired still, particular quality of self-containment that is sometimes mistaken for coldness, but which more often indicates a habit of managing emotion alone. She answered Morrow's questions in precise, unhurried sentences, her hands folded in her lap. Dora Caswell wept. This was the only natural response of the evening, and Morrow found himself somewhat grateful for it, as it confirmed that ordinary human reactions were still available to at least one person in the household. She was a slight young woman, as already noted, with her mother's dark hair, and, it was becoming apparent, her mother's careful self-possession beneath the tears. She confirmed the puzzle, the sitting room, and the fact that she had not left her mother's company between 7:30 and the moment of Treen's discovery. Oliver Quain was cooperative in a way that suggested cooperation was for him a professional skill. He was a tall, somewhat gaunt man with thinning fair hair and hands that appeared accustomed to handling documents. He confirmed that he had retired to his room after dinner, had read for a time, and had heard nothing from the direction of the tower until Treen's alarmed shout below his window. He was sorry for Caswell's death. He could not explain it. He hoped the matter would be resolved promptly, was the phrase, resolved promptly, that lingered with Constable Poirot after the inspector had driven back to Polwydden with the doctor and the body. Poirot, who had lived all his life in this corner of Cornwall and knew something of the human texture of small, closed communities, sat in the cottage kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold before him, and turned the phrase over in his mind. It was not the language of a man who felt nothing. It was the language of a man who felt something specific and wished it to be settled quickly. Poirot, who 3 days later wrote the letter to London. A careful, precise letter addressed to an address in Whitehaven Mansions, suggesting that the matter might benefit from a particular quality of attention that the local constabulary, with the best will in the world, was not equipped to provide. He had heard of Hercule Poirot. He had, in fact, read every newspaper account of the man's cases with the diligent attention of someone who suspects that genius, in this world, exists in forms he cannot fully understand but greatly admires. He posted the letter on a Thursday. By Saturday, a reply had come. Chapter 3. The Belgian and the fog Hercule Poirot arrived at Dunmorrow on a grey Monday morning in a hired car, driven by a young man from Polwydden, who spoke not at all during the 40-minute journey, and who deposited his passenger at the Cliff Road, turning with an expression of mild relief, as though he had successfully delivered something fragile across a considerable distance. Poirot stepped out, adjusted his coat. A beautifully cut affair in dark wool, entirely unsuitable for a Cornish cliff-top in September, and surveyed the scene before him with the particular quality of attention that his friends had long ago stopped trying to describe to people who had not witnessed it. It was not, strictly speaking, looking. It was more as though he was receiving information from the landscape through a faculty beyond the purely visual. The lighthouse was, he thought, an appropriate setting. A lighthouse exists to warn. It stands at the very edge of safety and says, with its revolving eye, "Here is the limit of the known. Here begins the dangerous dark." That such a place should become the site of a crime was not, Poirot's mind, a coincidence, though he would have been the first to observe that coincidences, in his experience, were almost never what they claimed to be. Constable Poirot met him at the cottage gate, a small wicket in a low stone wall, beyond which a flagged path led to the door. The constable was a larger man than his letters had suggested, broad, honest face, and the particular expression of someone who has done something slightly irregular, and is not entirely sure it will be proved of. "Miss Poirot, I am very glad you have come. I hope the journey was not, that is, the road from Polwydden is not." "The road is terrible," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "All roads in England that lead to beautiful places are terrible. It is as though beauty demands suffering as the price of admission. No matter. I am here, tell me. Has anything been disturbed since you wrote to me?" Poirot assured him it had not, with the qualification that Inspector Morrow had conducted 2 further interviews, and had formed, he believed, working theory. Poirot absorbed this information without visible alarm. The inspector's theory, it centres upon whom? "Jack Treen, sir, the handyman. The inspector believes Treen may have had a quarrel with the deceased regarding wages. There was a matter of some unpaid money, it seems, and Treen had the opportunity." "Everyone had the opportunity," Poirot observed gently. "That is why the case is interesting. Proust." He was introduced to the household over the course of that morning, beginning with Mrs. Vera Caswell, who received him in the sitting-room with the composed politeness of a woman who has dealt with official persons before and has learned to reveal nothing that was not specifically requested. She was, Poirot noted, beautifully groomed, her hair arranged with precision, dress pressed, and this at 10 in the morning, 3 days after a death in the household. Either she was a woman of great natural self-discipline, or she had reason to wish to make a particular impression. Poirot filed the observation and said nothing. Dora Caswell met him in the small painting room that she used as a studio, north-facing room off the main corridor, whose walls were hung with watercolours of extraordinary quality. All sea, all Cornish coast, rendered in blues and greys of the kind that only someone who had stared at those particular waters for years could mix correctly, pale but composed. She offered him tea. He accepted, noting as he did so the slight tension in her left hand, which she had pressed flat against her thigh, as though consciously stopping it from some movement. Oliver Quain received him standing near the window of his room, with the document case on the table beside him, and his hands in his jacket pockets. He was a man who occupied space deliberately. Poirot thought every position he chose was a position, a small act of statement. Standing near the window, said, "I have nothing to hide. I am open to examination. I have chosen where to stand." "You are a solicitor, Mr. Quain," Poirot said, looking not at the man but at the document case. "I am. And you came here 3 weeks ago, in the middle of a war, along an inconvenient road, to a village at the edge of England, for your health." A pause, precisely calibrated. "My doctor recommended it." "Naturally," said Poirot, and smiled with warm, absolute blankness. He spent an hour with Jack Treen in the outbuilding, surrounded by the smell of oil and rope and old iron. Treen was a short, square man of 55, with a Cornish deliberateness of speech that some people read as slowness, and that Poirot correctly identified as the habit of a man who chooses words because he understands they are irreversible once spoken. He answered every question fully. He had been owed 4 months' salary. Caswell had been difficult about money for the past year. Yes, he had been angry. No, He had not gone up the tower. With Polly Treen, Poirot was briefer. She was a woman, he sensed, who observed everything, and had learned, over a lifetime, that observation was a private resource not to be shared with people one did not trust. He did not yet have her trust. He would work toward it. He asked only one question of significance. Mrs. Treen, Mr. Caswell's brother Reginald, who died in London in January. You knew him? Pause before her answer was 3 seconds long. He visited, now and then. He was, I understand, a man of some means. I wouldn't know about that, sir. Poirot thanked her pleasantly, and went to walk the cliff path alone, his hands clasped behind his back, his small, neat figure quite incongruous against the massive grey indifference of the Atlantic. He walked for a considerable time. To an observer, he appeared to be doing nothing at all. In fact, he was beginning to see the shape of the thing. Chapter 4. A circle of careful mouths. On the morning of his second full day at Dunmorrow, Poirot conducted what he privately termed his systematic conversations. A series of interviews, organised not according to the inspector's logic of suspected guilt, but according to his own logic of necessary truth. Each person in a closed circle of this kind possessed some portion of the complete picture. The art of investigation was not the discovery of guilt. Guilt was, in the end, always discoverable, but the assembly of the picture before any single person realised it was being assembled. He began with Dora Caswell, approaching the matter differently than the day before. This time, he asked not about the night of the death, but about the months preceding it. What had Edmund Caswell been like in, say, June, July? Had his temperament changed? Dora considered this with a care that Poirot found rather touching in its honesty. She was not a dissembling young woman. He had established that already. She simply moved slowly through truth, because she wished to be accurate rather than merely helpful. He was different, she said at last. From about June, I should say. He became shorter in his manner, more watchful. He began locking the study, which he had never done before. He received letters, at least 2, I believe, that disturbed him. He burned them both, but he burned them in the sitting-room fire rather than his study grate, and I saw him do it once, which was unusual. Why unusual? Because he was hurrying, she said simply. Uncle Edmund never hurried. This was useful. Poirot noted it with the small, precise satisfaction of a man who has turned a page, and found that the next chapter begins exactly where he hoped it might. He visited the locked study. Inspector Morrow had forced it open on the night of the discovery, and it had been available since, and spent 2 careful hours there. The room was tidy with the tidiness of a man who believes in order not as an aesthetic preference, but as a moral position. The bookshelves held maritime texts, tide tables from various decades, and a complete run of the Nautical magazine from 1919 to 1941. In the desk, which had been searched by Morrow's men, and found to contain nothing significant, Poirot found 3 things of interest which the inspector's men had not considered significant. Turn half of a railway ticket from Paddington to Polwydden, dated the 2nd of August. A catalogue from an auction house in St. Austell, with 3 lots circled in pencil, and, pressed beneath the base of the inkwell, a small piece of pale green paper approximately 3 inches by 2, on which someone had written in a compact, backward, slanting hand, "You know very well what becomes of men who refuse. Think of Reginald." Poirot read this note 3 times. He then replaced it precisely as he had found it, picked up his coat, and went to find Oliver Quain. Quain was in the parlour, with his document case open on the table before him, through which he was passing papers with the systematic focus of a man conducting an audit. He looked up without surprise. He had, Poirot thought, been expecting this visit, and had decided to conduct it on his own terms by presenting himself as already deeply occupied. "The 2nd of August, Poirot said, taking a chair without being invited. "You arrived at Dunmorrow on—" "The 25th of August, Quain said, without hesitation. "And you had not visited before?" "I had not. But you knew Edmund Caswell." A pause, brief but present. "We had met in London some years ago." "In what capacity?" "Caswell had some legal matters. I handled them." "You are a solicitor who came to the home of a former client," Poirot said pleasantly, "for a period of rest, carrying a document case." "People carry document cases," Quain said, with a trace of something that was not quite irritation. "Indeed they do. Tell me, Mr. Quain, the legal matters you handled for Mr. Caswell, were they of a personal nature, or were they connected with the estate of the late Reginald Caswell?" The pause this time was longer. Outside, foghorn gave one long mournful note, as if the sea itself had decided to comment. Quain set down his papers with deliberate care and looked at Poirot directly for the first time. "You are very quick," he said. "I am not quick," Poirot replied. "I am merely attentive. It is a different thing entirely, and in my experience far more productive." Quain said that Reginald Caswell's estate had been a complicated matter. Reginald had died intestate, without a will, which had created some difficulties. Edmund, as the surviving brother, had certain claims. There were also claims from Vera Caswell as the widow. The matter had not been fully resolved. How large was the estate? Approximately £40,000. Poirot received this figure with the equanimity of a man who has long since ceased to be surprised by what human beings will do for £40,000. He thanked Quain, admired the quality of the fog from the parlour window, and excused himself with the pleasant vagueness of a man going about no particular business. In the corridor, however, his expression became entirely different, small, still, and very alert. He needed to speak with Mrs. Vera Caswell again, and this time he intended to ask rather more direct questions. Chapter 5. The Widow and the Will Misses. Vera Caswell was in the garden when Poirot found her, or rather, she was standing at the garden gate, looking out toward the lighthouse, with her arms folded and her face turned into the wind off the sea. It was a posture that might have indicated grief, or contemplation, or simply the habit of standing at that particular spot. Poirot noted that she had chosen a position from which she could see the lighthouse tower without entering it, and found this detail, in its small way, significant. He approached without hurrying, as was his custom, stood beside her for a moment before speaking. The sea was the colour of old pewter this morning, and the lighthouse gleamed white against it, with the particular implacability of things that have outlasted the people who built them. "Mrs. Caswell, a Sulzn," he said, "you have been very patient with the questions of the inspector and his men. I am afraid I must ask a few more." She turned from the lighthouse to look at him. In the grey morning light, without the careful composure of the sitting-room, she looked older and considerably more tired. This, Poirot thought, was something closer to the truth of her. "Mr. Poirot," she said, "I should tell you something before you ask. I was not fond of Edmund. I think you have probably perceived that already. He was not a man who inspired fondness. He was, however, my brother-in-law, and I spent 8 months living in his house, and whatever I may have felt about him privately, I should like to know who killed him." "That is a remarkably candid opening," Poirot said, approval. "I am tired of being careful," she said simply. "I have been careful for months. I should like just once to say a direct thing." Poirot indicated the garden bench, and they sat together in the damp September air. He began with Reginald, the late husband, the London life, the nature of the marriage. Vera spoke of these things with a careful economy that told him more than extensive description would have done. Reginald had been a warm man. she said. Generous, perhaps unwisely so. He had had money from an inheritance and from a business venture in the 1920s that had done well. He had also, she added, with a slight pause, had a partner in that venture. His brother Edmund, Poirot said. Yes, and the nature of the venture. Another pause. Import and export. Before the war. I was never entirely clear on the details. Reginald did not trouble me with business matters. But after Reginald died, you came here, to Edmund. Why Mrs. Caswell, if the relationship was not warm? She was quiet for a moment. A gull crossed the sky between them and the lighthouse, crying once. Because, she said at last, Edmund had something of mine and Dora's, something that had belonged to Reginald and that Edmund was holding, documents, papers of a financial nature. And because Mr. Quain, who had handled Reginald's affairs, told me that if I wished to resolve the matter of the estate, it would be necessary to speak to Edmund directly. And in 8 months, was this not resolved? No, she said flatly. Edmund refused to discuss it. He said the documents were safe and that there would be time. He always said there would be time. Poirot absorbed this. He thought of the note under the inkwell. Think of Reginald, and of the auction catalogue with its circled lots. He asked, with the casualness of someone changing the subject. Your daughter, Miss Dora, she has, I believe, formed some attachment while here in Dunmorrow. The shift in Vera's expression was minute but unmistakable. A fractional tightening around the eyes, a slight recalibration of posture. Dora has friends in the village, she said carefully. I was thinking of a particular friend. A young man, perhaps. Someone who visits the Point? Vera looked at him directly. You are very thorough, Monsieur Poirot. I try to be, madame. There was, it emerged, with some gentle persistence on Poirot's part, a young man. His name was Peter Searle. He was 28, the son of a local boat builder, and he had been calling upon Dora with increasing regularity since July. Edmund had disapproved, on grounds both social and temperamental. He thought the boy beneath his niece's consideration, and had said so directly and unkindly more than once. The most recent of these declarations had occurred at dinner, Sunday before, on the Sunday, Edmund's death, and it had been, by Vera's careful account, rather unpleasant. Words had been raised. Dora had left the table. Edmund had pronounced himself finished with the subject, and Dora had sat in a painting room until midnight, and had, the following morning, the red-rimmed eyes of someone who has wept comprehensively. Poirot thanked Mrs. Caswell, stood, and brushed a non-existent speck from the knee of his trousers. He was aware of something settling into shape in his mind. Not a conclusion, not yet, but a structure, a frame upon which conclusions might eventually be hung. The death of Edmund Caswell was not a simple killing. It was the end point of a long arrangement, a terminal act in a story that had begun not here on this Cornish cliff, but somewhere in London, in a set of ledgers, in a legal office, in the provisions of a will that might not have been a will at all. He needed to see Peter Searle, and he needed to look again at that auction catalogue. Chapter 6. The Lot That Was Never Sold. The auction catalogue was from St. Austell, dated the 4th of September, 11 days before the death. It was a general sale. Furniture, maritime antiques, various household effects from the estate of a local family. Of the 3 lots that Caswell had circled in pencil, 2 were unremarkable, a set of navigation instruments and a Victorian ship's clock. The third was more interesting. Lot 47, described as a collection of private correspondence and business documents, mid-20th century, provenance coastal Cornwall. The estimated selling price was modest, £12 to £20. The notation beside it, in Caswell's cramped hand, was a single word: impossible. Poirot took the catalogue to Constable Perrot. and asked him to make inquiries with the auction house regarding Lot 47. Specifically, whether the lot had in fact been sold, and if so, to whom. Poirot, who had by now acquired a considerable confidence in Poirot's instincts, agreed to do this within the day. He then walked to the village, which occupied a natural hollow in the cliff above the small harbour, consisting of 14 houses, a post office, the pub, and a chandler's shop that also sold tinned goods. Boat builder's yard was at the harbour's edge, a low corrugated building with the smell of pitch and sawdust drifting from it even at a distance. Peter Searle was inside, planing a length of timber. He was a good-looking young man in a direct, unaffected way, strong-built, dark, the kind of open face that keeps fewer secrets than it intends to. He set down the plane when Poirot entered and looked at the small Belgian with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "You'll be the detective they sent for," he said. "I am," Poirot agreed. "And you are Mr. Searle, been calling upon Miss Dora Caswell." "I have. Yes," he folded his arms, not aggressively, but with the instinct of a man preparing for something he has been anticipating. "I suppose someone said something. Several people have said several things," Poirot said comfortably, sitting himself upon a low stool without invitation. "I am here to form my own view. Tell me, how long have you known Miss Caswell?" Searle had met Dora in early June, when she had come to the harbour to sketch the boats. He had struck up a conversation with considerable natural confidence, and had found her, he put it with a directness that Poirot found refreshing, unlike anyone he had met. They had walked on the cliffs together, and gradually, with the care that both of them brought to the enterprise, she from temperament, and he from a practical awareness of Edmund Caswell's probable reaction, what had begun as friendship had become something considerably warmer. Mr. Caswell knew of the friendship. He knew of it and disliked it thoroughly, Searle said without apparent bitterness. He told me to my face the second week of August, came to the yard himself, here, and told me that his niece was not to be made a fool of by a tradesman's son, and that if I had any decency I would understand his meaning without being told twice. "And how did you respond?" "I told him," Searle said evenly, "that Dora was 24 years old and perfectly capable of deciding for herself whom she might or might not speak to, and that if she wished to stop seeing me, she was welcome to say so herself." He did not appreciate this response, I take it. He called me insolent and went away. Poirot was thoughtful. "On the evening of the 15th of September, Wednesday last, where were you, between the hours of 8 and 10 in the evening?" Searle met the question with the directness Poirot had come to expect from him. He had been, he said, walking on the cliff path. Alone, he had done this 2 or 3 times a week, as he had always done. The cliff path between the village and the point was a public right-of-way that he had walked since childhood. He had not gone to the lighthouse. He had turned back, he believed, at the old style, which was some 100 yards short of the point. You saw no one on the path that evening. A beat, small but definite. No one. Poirot noted the beat and filed it. He asked a few more questions of no apparent significance. About the boat-building business, about the effect of the war on coastal trade, about Searle's father, and then excused himself with warm thanks and walked back toward the point. He had nearly reached the cottage gate when Constable Poirot appeared from the lane, slightly breathless, with a notebook in his hand. "The auction house, sir, lot 47. The documents." "Yes?" Poirot turned. "It never came to auction, sir. The lot was withdrawn on the 12th of September. 3 days before the death. Withdrawn by the vendor. The auction house says the vendor was a Mr. Quain of London." Poirot was still for a moment. The foghorn sounded from the point below, one long, carrying note. "R. Quain," he murmured. "Not Oliver Quain, R. Quain." "That's what they said, sir, R. Quain." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and looked out over the grey water with an expression that Perrault would later describe, attempting to convey it to his wife that evening, as the look of a man who has found the corner piece of a very large puzzle. Chapter 7. Buried Partners. Poirot spent that evening in the cottage study with a notepad, the auction catalogue, and the railway ticket. He arranged these objects on the desk before him with the same precision that a surgeon brings to instruments, and he looked at them for some time. Then he wrote in his small European hand 3 names in a column: Edmund Caswell, Reginald Caswell, R. Quain. Below the names he wrote 1920s, Port Frauds. Documents in danger of auction September 1943. Below that, Oliver Quain, solicitor, arrives 25th August, £40,000 contested estate. What does he want from whom? The following morning he went to Polwydden and used the telephone in the police station, placing 2 calls, one to a contact at Somerset House in London, and one to an acquaintance in the legal profession whose discretion and extensive knowledge of professional gossip Poirot had found, on several occasions, equally invaluable. Both calls were productive. He returned to Dunmorrow in the hired car with a considerably fuller picture of the recent history of the Caswell brothers and their associates. What he had learned was this. In 1921, Edmund Caswell and his brother Reginald had established a small import business operating out of the Bristol Channel. The business had been legitimate in its declared activity: dried goods, naval stores, certain manufactured articles, but had carried, alongside its declared cargo, a secondary trade in items that did not appear on manifests, and whose nature, though never formally established in court, had caused the Board of Customs considerable quiet interest for the better part of a decade. Third director of the company, listed at its registration and removed from the directorship in 1928, one Raymond Quain, the father of Oliver Quain, who had died in 1939. Raymond Quain had kept records. It was the habit of careful men who engaged in enterprises of uncertain legality. Such records served as insurance, as protection, the implicit threat underlying every subsequent dealing. These records, the documents of Lot 47, had, upon Raymond's death, passed to Oliver, and Oliver had brought them to Cornwall not as a blackmailer's ultimatum, but as a solicitor's negotiating instrument. He had wanted a settlement of the contested estate in his favour, or rather, behalf of some arrangement that his father's records had given him the leverage to demand. Edmund Caswell had known about the documents. He had known, indeed, since June, when Oliver had written to him, which explained the destroyed letters and the changed temperament that Dora had noticed. He had come to St. Austell in August on the railway ticket, had gone to the auction house, and had discovered that Oliver had already considered using the sale as a means of dispersal, of making the documents public and allowing the chips to fall. The circled Lot 47, the single word impossible. On the 12th of September, Oliver had withdrawn the lot. This meant he had decided on a different approach. Direct negotiation, perhaps, or direct action. He had been at Dunmorrow 3 days by then. Poirot sat with this history and turned it in his mind. It established motive for Oliver Quain. The documents gave him leverage. Yes, but killing Caswell would remove the possibility of resolution, not achieve it, unless the documents were already secured. Unless Edmund had in fact given Oliver what he wanted, and the killing had been for a different reason entirely. Or unless the killing was not Oliver's at all, because there remained the question of the note. Think of Reginald. This note had been in Caswell's desk. It had not been identified by Morrow's men as significant because they had not known what Reginald signified. But Poirot knew. Or rather, he was beginning to know, in the particular way that his investigations proceeded. Not through leaps, but through accretion, through the patient assembly of small truths until the large truth became visible. A coastline becomes visible to the approaching mariner, not all at once, but in pieces, one headland and then another, till the whole shore is known. He went to find Polly Treen. Not in the kitchen this time, but in the linen room at the end of the corridor, where she was folding sheets with the methodical concentration of someone who finds in domestic tasks a refuge from thoughts too large for the inside, a small house. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and she did not pretend not to have been expecting him. "You knew about the business," Poirot said quietly. Not a question. She set down the sheet she was holding. "Jack's father worked the Bristol boats in those years," she said. "He knew what came and went. Yes, I knew something. And Reginald Caswell's death in London in January. Was it Mrs. Treen? Entirely natural death?" The silence lasted long enough that Poirot could hear the wind against the window glass. Then Polly Treen said, in a voice that had in it something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but contained elements of both. "He had a weak heart. The doctors said so. But Edmund was in London the week before. I know because he asked Jack to drive him to Pulwidden Station, and when he came back he had changed. Changed how? Settled, she said. That's the only word. Like a man who has done something he'd been working up to. Settled and quieter, and somehow finished." Poirot thanked her with great gentleness, and went out into the corridor and stood quite still for a very long time. Chapter 8. What Dora painted at midnight. The thing about a closed circle of suspects in a closed setting is that the walls of the circle are also walls of the imagination. Each person inside it begins, after a certain number of days, to arrange the world in a particular way. I am innocent. One of these others is guilty. If I wait, or if I say nothing, or if I say the right thing at the right moment, the dangerous person will be identified, and I will be left in peace. This arrangement is rarely accurate, and the inaccuracy is dangerous not because it protects the guilty party, but because it prevents the innocent from contributing what they know. Poirot was aware, by this point in his inquiry, that at least 2 members of the Dunmorrow household were maintaining silences that were not protective of themselves, but of someone else. This was a more complicated situation than ordinary deceit, and it required a different approach. He could not simply press for truth. He must first create the conditions under which the truth felt safe to speak. He chose Dora Caswell as the person most likely to have reached the limit of her endurance first. She was not a natural deceiver. The tension in her left hand, the red-rimmed eyes, the way she had moved through the past several days with the careful deliberateness of someone who has too many things to keep track of, simultaneously. All of these told him that whatever she was holding it at some cost. He found her in the painting room on Thursday evening, attempting to work on a canvas of the eastern cliff face that had, to Poirot's eye, painted and repainted so many times it was beginning to lose its underlying form. "Miss Caswell," he said gently from the doorway, "I wonder if you would be kind enough to tell me what you were painting on the night of Wednesday the 15th. She turned from the canvas. Face in the lamplight was a careful arrangement that was beginning to come apart at the edges. "I was in the sitting room with my mother," she said. "I told the inspector." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "You were in the sitting room, you and your mother, working a puzzle from 7:30. But Miss Caswell—" "The puzzle box was on the mantelpiece when I arrived on Monday. It was not in a state of being worked. It was complete. The corners were beginning to curl slightly with moisture, as puzzle boxes do when they have been in a room with a fire burning for some time. Believe the puzzle had been completed some days, perhaps weeks before the 15th. Dora Caswell sat down on the stool before her easel as though her legs had decided to stop managing the pretense. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known the puzzle since my first day here?" But I waited because I wished to understand why before I asked about what. The why matters enormously in these cases. A lie told to protect someone one loves is a very different thing from a lie told to protect oneself. The story she told was this. On the evening of the 15th, she had not been in the sitting room with her mother. She had been for approximately 40 minutes, from 8 until about 20 to 9, on the cliff path, not alone, with Peter Searle, who had come along the path from the village side to meet her at the old stile. They had stood together in the darkness and the beginning of the fog and talked, as young people in the grip of a complicated situation will do, about their future, or whether they had one, and about Edmund's opposition, and about what they might do. She had returned to the cottage at 20 to 9. Her mother had covered for her, had told the inspector they were together all evening, because Vera Caswell knew about Peter, and had long since decided that her brother-in-law's interference in her daughter's life was something she would not port. "Peter was with you the entire time?" "He did not approach the lighthouse. He was with me. We were at the stile the whole time." She looked at Poirot directly. "He didn't do it. You must believe me. He had no reason to. He's not that sort of person. And besides, he knew I was coming back. If Edmund had been a real obstacle, we would have left, gone somewhere else. People do. Did you see anyone on the path? Anyone going toward the point?" Here she hesitated, and Poirot, watching her with great attention, saw not the hesitation of someone constructing a useful fiction, but the hesitation of someone determining how large a truth they were about to release. "When I was coming back," she said slowly, "just as I turned back from the stile toward the cottage, I saw someone." "Who?" "Couldn't be certain. The fog was coming in, but the figure was coming from the direction of the lighthouse, not going toward it. Coming from it, and it was walking very quickly." "Could you describe the figure?" "Tall," she said. "Thin. A man, I think. Moving, not running, but near it." Poirot nodded slowly and was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sea made its eternal tireless argument against the cliff face below. "Thank you, Miss Caswell," he said at last. "You have been very courageous this evening now. I must ask you to do one more difficult thing. I must ask you to say nothing of this conversation to anyone in the household tonight. Tomorrow, I believe, we shall be able to speak more openly." She agreed, with the exhausted relief of someone who has put down a very heavy weight. Poirot left her, went to the kitchen for the cup of tea that Mrs. Treen silently and competently provided, and sat alone with his thoughts for an hour. Tall, thin, a man, moving very quickly from the direction of the lighthouse at approximately 20 to 9 on the night of the 15th. That description, added to everything else, had narrowed the field considerably. Almost entirely, in fact. Chapter 9. The ledger that should not exist Poirot did not sleep for a considerable portion of that night. This was not unusual for him at this stage of an investigation. It was the period during which the little grey cells, as he was accustomed to calling them, performed their most productive work, sorting and connecting and testing the assembled evidence against one hypothesis after another with the thoroughness of a mathematician checking a proof. By 3 in the morning he had identified one significant piece of evidence that he did not yet possess. By 4 he had formed a plan for obtaining it. By 7 he was dressed, immaculate, and in the kitchen before Mrs. Treen, which surprised her considerably. "An early start, Monsieur Poirot," she said, pulling her robe tighter as she came in from the corridor. "Matter of urgency, Madame Treen," he replied pleasantly. "I wonder, the night of the 15th, your husband was in the outbuilding, tending to the foghorn mechanism. You confirmed this?" "I did. And when did he come in?" She began filling the kettle, her back to him. "Round 9, perhaps a bit after. He was in the outbuilding the entire time, from dinner until 9. He was. Did anyone visit him there? Come to the outbuilding for any reason?" A pause in the movement of filling the kettle. Small but present. "Not that I know of." Poirot thanked her pleasantly and went to the outbuilding himself. The pulley mechanism in question? The cable assembly for the foghorn warning system was a heavy iron arrangement mounted on the wall behind the main compressor. Poirot examined it with interest. There was, Treen had indicated, evidence of maintenance work. Fresh oil replaced cable segment. But there was also, on the floor beneath the old cable coil, something that Morrow's men had not thought to look for because they had not known that the outbuilding was important. A small oil smear, the dimensions of a shoe sole, partially covered by the coil and pointing toward the door. A second set of footprints had been here that evening. Someone who had not been working, but who had come to speak to Treen. Someone who had stood near the door and then left, and who had, in passing the oil on the floor, left this single print, partial and directional, like an inadvertent signature. He measured the print against his memory of the shoes in the household. The impression was long and narrow. A man of large frame, wearing well-made shoes. Not a labourer's boot. Not Treen's broad work boot. Something rather more London. The morning passed. At 10 o'clock, Poirot asked Oliver Quain if he might see the document case. Not its contents, merely to confirm that it was locked. Quain confirmed it was locked and looked at Poirot with the measuring gaze of someone who is deciding whether to be alarmed. Poirot thanked him and went back to the study. At 11, Constable Perrot arrived with additional information from London, obtained through police channels. Raymond Quain's estate, upon his death in 1939, had included a sealed ledger deposited with his solicitors, the firm of which Oliver Quain was now senior partner, with instructions that it be opened only in the event of a legal dispute involving the business records of the Caswell Brothers Trading Company. Such dispute had been formally lodged. But Oliver had opened it anyway, in January 1943, immediately following the death of Reginald Caswell, January 1943. The month Reginald Caswell had died. Poirot sat very still with this for a long moment. Then he said to Perrot, "The ledger, does it exist still? Was it returned to the solicitor's deposit?" Perrot checked his notes. "Unknown, sir. The solicitor's firm has been cooperative, but say the original is no longer in their vaults. It was signed out in January. It has not been returned. It is in the document case," Poirot said quietly. "I am almost certain of it. Oliver Quain came here carrying the evidence of crimes committed by Edmund and Reginald Caswell 20 years ago. Evidence sufficient, in the wrong hands, to retrospectively implicate the surviving brother, to destroy his reputation and potentially result in prosecution. He came here to negotiate. He wanted the estate settled, Vera Caswell's share confirmed, and in return, the ledger, the original, would be handed over. And Caswell refused. Caswell had been refusing for 3 months. He thought, perhaps, that Quain would not dare to make the documents public, that the risk of professional embarrassment to himself as a solicitor operating outside proper channels would be sufficient deterrent. He was mistaken about Quain's determination. But if Quain killed him? Yes, Poirot said. Quain killed him. The leverage was gone, and the problem was solved. But solved for whom? That is the question, Poirot. That is precisely the question. He stood and straightened his coat. Tomorrow morning I shall ask everyone to gather in the sitting room. Believe I am ready. Chapter 10. The Gathering at the Point. The sitting room of the Lighthouse cottage was not large. It had been designed in the utilitarian tradition of Lighthouse Authority residences for practical comfort rather than social occasion, the gathering of 5 people. Mrs. Vera Caswell, Dora Caswell, Oliver Quain, Jack Treen, Polly Treen. Around its central furniture gave it an air of considerable compression, as though the room itself were aware of the pressure building within it. Inspector Morrow sat to one side in a dining chair that Constable Poirot had carried in. Poirot stood near the door. Poirot stood before the fireplace. Not in the manner of a man warming himself, as the morning had for once produced a pale autumn sunshine, but in the manner of a man who has chosen a position from which everyone in the room is equally visible. He appeared to Inspector Morrow, watching him with the watchful respect the inspector had developed over the past 4 days, to be entirely at ease. Which was, Morrow had come to understand, not a natural state of Poirot's, but a performed one, the ease of a man who has concluded his internal work and is now executing a final, external stage. "I thank you all for being here," Poirot began, in a conversational tone that somehow filled the room completely. "I shall not take more of your time than is necessary. But I have found in my experience that it is better to explain to a thing in the presence of everyone concerned. It prevents misunderstanding, and it has the additional benefit of making certain kinds of denial very difficult." Oliver Quain sat with his hands folded on his knee, his expression suggesting polite attention. Vera Caswell looked at the fireplace. Dora looked at Poirot. The Treens sat side by side on the small sofa, with the rigid proximity of 2 people who have said everything necessary to each other already, and are now waiting for what cannot be avoided. "Let me begin with the facts that are not in dispute," Poirot continued. "Edmund Caswell died on the evening of the 15th of September between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, in the lamp room of this lighthouse, from a blow to the right temple. He was alone, or appeared to be alone, when he went up those stairs. Someone went up after him, was already there. The lamp room was not forced. The staircase has no lock. Anyone in this household could have ascended those stairs at any time." He paused as much for effect as for thought. "Now, I shall tell you what happened. Not what might have happened. Not what the evidence suggests might possibly have happened, but what happened. Because I am certain." The room had the quality of held breath. Even Morrow found himself sitting slightly forward. "Edmund Caswell," Poirot said, "was a man who had spent his life doing things that were, let us say, not entirely lawful. In the 1920s, he and his brother Reginald, and a third partner, Raymond Quain, father of the gentleman present, ran a trading company that supplemented its legitimate income with the smuggling of certain goods through the Bristol Channel. The details need not concern us here. The important thing is that records of this activity were kept, carefully and comprehensively, by Raymond Quain. These records passed upon Raymond's death in 1939 to his son Oliver. Quain did not move. He might have been carved from the same grey stone as the lighthouse. In January of this year, Poirot continued, Reginald Caswell died in London. His death was recorded as cardiac failure, consistent with his known condition, but there are grounds, circumstantial but significant, to believe that Reginald's death was not entirely natural, that Edmund, who was in London in the days preceding it, may have assisted his brother's departure from this world. The motive was clear. Reginald's estate, amounting to £40,000, would pass entirely to Edmund as the surviving heir, rather than being shared with Vera, if Reginald died without a will, and if Edmund could manage the situation appropriately. Vera Caswell had not moved, but she had closed her eyes. Dora's hand found her mother's wrist. "Oliver Quain," Poirot continued, turning to the man directly, opened his father's sealed ledger in January, upon hearing of Reginald's death, and understood immediately that it represented considerable leverage. He did not go to the police. Instead, he came here in August to negotiate. The price of his silence, of the destruction of the documents, was a settlement of the estate that would properly acknowledge Mrs. Vera Caswell's position as Reginald's widow. "This is speculation," Quain said. His voice was very level. "It was speculation until yesterday," Poirot replied calmly. "It is rather less so now, but let us move on. The question before us is not the matter of the smuggling records, or of Reginald Caswell's death. Those are matters for other authorities at another time. The question is, killed Edmund Caswell on the 15th of September. Chapter 11. The Precision of a Wrong Moment. I shall tell you what each person in this room did on the evening of the 15th. Poirot said, and in doing so, I shall demonstrate why only one of those actions resulted in death. He began with Dora Caswell, who, he said with a gentle acknowledgment of her courage, had been on the cliff path with Peter Searle. He would not dwell on this. It was irrelevant to the murder, and the matter of their friendship was, he noted with a composed authority that left no room for objection, entirely their own affair. Vera Caswell had been in the sitting room alone from approximately 8 o'clock. She had covered for her daughter as a matter of course. She had not left the sitting room. She had heard, at approximately 8:30, footsteps on the staircase. She had assumed it was Polly Treen going to her room. It was not. Polly Treen had been in the kitchen until 9, which was confirmed by the state of the kitchen. The washing up completed, the surfaces wiped, all consistent with her habitual 9 o'clock finish. She had then gone to the parlour. She had not ascended the staircase at 8:30. Jack Treen had been in the outbuilding. He had, however, received a visitor at approximately 8:15. Someone who came to the outbuilding door spoke to Treen for several minutes and then returned to the cottage. The oil print on the floor confirmed this. Treen had not mentioned this visitor when questioned, which was itself a significant fact, and one to which Poirot would return. "That visitor," Poirot said, looking at Quain, "was you, Mr. Quain. You went to speak to Jack Treen at 8:15. You were in the outbuilding for perhaps 10 minutes. You then returned to the cottage. But you did not go to your room. You went up the staircase, and at the top of the staircase, you went through the lamp room door." The silence in the sitting room was of the particular quality that precedes either an admission or a denial. Poirot did not fill it. He had learned, over many decades, that silence is occasionally the most productive instrument in an investigator's collection. "You had gone to Treen," Poirot continued, "to tell him that you were going to speak to Caswell. You needed Treen to know, because Treen was your safety in a sense. If something went wrong, Treen could confirm that you had been at the outbuilding at that hour, and therefore could not have been on the stairs. It was a sensible precaution. Fortunately, it was also a mistake, because it placed you definitively at the scene at a time that made your subsequent account, that you retired to your room after dinner, impossible." I went to speak to him," Quain said suddenly. His voice was still controlled, but something behind it had shifted. "That is all I intended, to speak to him, to tell him that I would make the documents public, that I had reached the end of my patience. 3 months of letters, of waiting, being managed. I had come here, I had been here 4 weeks, and he continued to refuse every reasonable proposal. I went up to say that it was finished, that the next morning I would contact the authorities. And what occurred? We argued. A pause. He became aggressive. He said that if I contacted anyone, he would inform on me as well, that my father had been as complicit as he was, and that I had concealed evidence of criminal activity by not bringing the ledger forward at the proper time. Which was true, of course. He was correct about that. He said that we were both equally implicated, and that if I took him down, I would bring myself down also. And then he moved toward me. He put his hand on my chest, pushed me. I pushed back. He lost his footing. Another pause, longer. He struck his head on the housing. I heard the sound. I knew immediately. I stood there for I don't know how long. And then I went down the stairs. Inspector Morrow was on his feet. Poirot held up one small hand, a gesture of restraint that Morrow, despite his professional instincts, somehow obeyed. "One moment, Inspector, Mr. Quain. You say he pushed you, and you pushed him. He lost his footing. This is your account of what occurred." "It is the truth. The doctor's report states the blow was consistent with a fall against a hard surface," Poirot said. "It was also consistent with a deliberate blow. These are two different things, and the distinction matters enormously." Quain said nothing. He had, Poirot thought, said everything he intended to say. Whether it was the complete truth or a carefully selected portion of it was a question that now belonged to a court of law rather than to this sitting room. But there was one more thing. Poirot turned from Quain and looked at Jack Treen, who had been sitting in perfect stillness throughout, his large hands resting on his knees, his broad face unreadable. "Mr. Treen," Poirot said quietly, "you did not tell the inspector about Mr. Quain's visit to the outbuilding." "Why?" Treen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He'd been good to us, Mr. Quain," he'd said. "If the estate business was settled right, there'd be something in it for those who'd been loyal. And Caswell owed me 4 months' wages." He looked at the floor. "I didn't know what had happened up there. I just knew Quain had come and gone, and then the light wasn't on. I hoped it might be, not what it was." "We are rarely permitted," Poirot said gently, "to have it be not what it was." Chapter 12. The House of Cards Falls Inward. Inspector Morrow made his arrest, with efficiency and without drama, which, Poirot reflected, was the correct approach. Oliver Quain did not resist. He stood and buttoned his jacket and preceded Sergeant Bates out of the sitting room with the composure of a man who has, on some level, been anticipating this conclusion for quite some time. The document case he left on the table, though he understood that it was no longer his to take. The room, when he had gone, had the hollowed quality of a space, suddenly made larger by the removal of the thing that had been filling it. Vera Caswell remained seated, hands still folded in her lap, looking at the wall opposite her, with an expression that was beginning, very slowly, to change from the containment of the past several days into something rawer and more difficult. Dora sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Morrow returned briefly to inform Poirot that Quain would be held in Polwhidden pending charges, and that the document case would be taken as evidence. He shook Poirot's hand with the warm, slightly uncertain grip of a man who is deeply grateful and not entirely sure how to express it. Then he was gone, and Perrault remained by the door. The cottage was quiet except for the sea. Poirot sat down. He chose the chair that Edmund Caswell had occupied at dinner, which no one in the household had sat in since, and crossed his legs and looked at Mrs. Treen, who stood in the doorway between the sitting-room and the corridor, with her hands clasped together before her. "Mrs. Treen," he said, "would there be any possibility of tea?" There would, it appeared, be every possibility of tea. Mrs. Treen went away. the small domestic sound of her movements in the kitchen. The filling of the kettle, precise click of the caddy lid, made the room feel somewhat more bearable. "What will happen to us?" Dora asked. Not hysterically, practically, in the way that a young woman who has spent months managing an unmanageable situation asks what comes next. "The estate," Poirot said, "will now be considered in the absence of Edmund Caswell's claims upon it. As the widow, Mrs. Caswell has a very strong position. There will be legal complications. There always are. But I believe you will find that the immediate difficulty is resolved. The longer-term matters, including the question of Reginald's death, I cannot speak to with certainty. That will be for others to examine." Vera Caswell looked at him at last. "You believe Edmund killed Reginald," she said. It was not a question. "I believe it is possible," Poirot said carefully. "Believe it should be examined. I believe you have suspected it for some time." A long pause. "Since March," she said, "when I found his railway tickets in the desk. I couldn't know for certain, and even if I had known, what would I have done? Gone to the police and said, 'I believe my brother-in-law may have helped my husband die.' With no evidence? They would have been very kind and very useless." She looked away. "So I came here to find the evidence, the documents Edmund kept. The ones that proved what they'd done together in the 20s. I thought if I had those, I might have leverage, or at least understanding. You did not know that Quain had the same idea." "I did not know Quain existed until he arrived here in August." Slight pause. "He was rather alarming, actually, in the beginning. Very professional about the whole thing." Poirot smiled. A genuine one this time, with something almost fond in it. "The English talent for understatement," he murmured, "truly without limit." He stood and went to examine the watercolour on the wall above the mantelpiece, a painting of the lighthouse itself, seen from the sea at evening, with the light just beginning to show. It was Dora's work. It had the quality of her particular vision. The lighthouse in it was not the alarming monolith of the cliffs, but something more ambiguous, a slender column of pale stone in a vast grey world, its light just barely sufficient to be visible, just barely enough. "Your paintings are very good, Miss Caswell," Poirot said. "You have a particular eye for the true colour of things, which is different from the obvious colour." Dora, slightly surprised, thanked him, and then, after a moment, "Will you go and speak to Peter? He'll have heard. The village will know by this afternoon. He'll want to know what happened." "I shall speak to him," Poirot promised. "Boss. And I shall tell him that there is nothing in the matter that reflects poorly on anyone in this house. Or on anyone in the village either." Polly Treen brought the tea. It was strong and properly made, in a proper pot, with a proper cup rather than a mug. Poirot received it with the sincere pleasure of a man for whom the correct preparation of tea is not a trivial matter. He sat and drank it slowly, looking at the September light in the window, while around him the household of Dunmorrow Point began, in its careful and tentative way, to rearrange itself around the absence of the dead man and the shape of a possible future. Chapter 13, the note that named everything. There was one remaining thread, and Poirot attended to it the following morning. It was not a thread that bore upon the guilt or innocence of anyone still living. That matter had been settled. But it was a thread that, for his own satisfaction, he felt the need to follow to its end. The little grey cells, he had always believed, did not perform good work when left with loose ends. It was not their nature. The note under the inkwell. Think of Reginald. It had been written on pale green paper, in a backward slanting hand. It had not been written by Oliver Quain, whose hand he had seen on various documents, and which was altogether different. It had not been written by anyone in the household whose handwriting he had seen. Not Vera, not Dora, not the methodical block print of the maintenance log that represented Caswell's own writing. He walked to the village and called upon Poirot, had access to the local register office, and a thorough knowledge of who had and had not visited Dunmorrow since the arrival of Vera Caswell in January. What emerged over 2 hours of careful inquiry was a small, significant fact. Man had visited the point twice in the spring of that year, in March and in May. He had signed the register at the Dunmorrow Arms, the pub, on both occasions, spending one night each time. His name was given as G. Archer. Poirot sat with the pub register and looked at the signature for some time. It was in a backward slanting hand on pale green paper. The pub's registration forms were pale green. The hand was unmistakably the same as the notes. "Do you know a G. Archer?" he asked the publican, a Mr. Hosken, of advanced age and excellent memory. Archer? City fellow, London manner, about 50, grey-haired, thin, came both times to see Caswell, walked up to the point, spent a couple of hours. Caswell didn't look pleased to see him the second time. I saw them on the road. Did he say why he was visiting? Old business, he said, the first time. The second time he didn't say anything at all. Poirot thanked Hosken and went out into the pale autumn sunshine. G. Archer. The name told him very little. It was almost certainly not a real name, used precisely because it was not remarkable, because it would not be remembered. But the note told him a great deal. Someone had known about Reginald's death, not suspected but known, sufficient certainty to use it as a threat against Edmund directly. And that person had visited twice, in March and in May, before apparently ceasing to visit. Perhaps because a different arrangement had been made, or perhaps because the knowledge had been transferred to another pair of hands. There had been, in other words, a third party aware of Edmund's act, not Oliver Quain, who had known only about the old smuggling records. Someone who had direct knowledge of Reginald's death, someone who might have been in London in January. Someone who had subsequently communicated with Edmund in letters that were burned as soon as they were received. He could not identify this person with certainty. He had a backward slanting hand, a false name, physical description that matched 10,000 men in England, and 2 hotel registrations in a Cornish village. It was not enough. It would, perhaps, be enough for others. For the officers in London, who would eventually handle the question of Reginald Caswell's death, to pursue further. His own work here was done. He walked back along the cliff path in the mild morning, pausing at the old stile where Dora and Peter had stood in the fog and the beginning of things. From this point, the lighthouse was clearly visible, a white column rising from the furthest edge of the land, against a sky that had decided, for once, to be almost blue. The lens room windows caught the sun. It looked, in this light, entirely peaceful, a sturdy and competent structure performing its necessary function, innocent of everything that had happened inside its walls. But lighthouses are not innocent. They stand at the edge of the known precisely because the unknown is dangerous. Their whole purpose is to mark the limit of safety, to say, the clearest possible terms, that beyond this point there is nothing that can be reliably navigated. The light turns, the beam sweeps, the darkness outside the beam is full of things that the light cannot illuminate, but that exist nonetheless. Poirot, standing at the stile in the September sunshine, thought about this for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the cottage, brisk, purposeful step of a man who has done what he came to do, and is preparing to go home. Chapter 14. The Light Restored. On his last evening at Dunmorrow, Poirot walked the cliff path at dusk. This was not his usual practice. He was not, by temperament, a man who sought symbolic closure through landscape, but There was something he wished to see. Cliff Path was the place from which it would be most clearly visible. New keeper had been assigned by the Lighthouse Authority, a temporary appointment pending a permanent posting. The man had arrived that afternoon, competent-looking figure of about 45, with a naval coat and a quiet manner, who had introduced himself briefly to the household and gone about his duties with the efficiency of someone who understands that a lighthouse is not principally a dwelling but an instrument, and that the instrument's function must be restored as quickly as possible. At 9 o'clock, exactly, the correct time, the light came on. Poirot, standing at the stile, watched it appear. The great Fresnel lens beginning its rotation, sending its beam out across the darkening water in the wide, sweeping arc that had guided ships since 1887, turned with the unhurried regularity of a thing that has no interest in drama, that performs its function and continues performing it without reference to anything that may have occurred in its immediate vicinity. The sea received the light and scattered it into 10,000 reflected fragments, each one brief and complete. He stood there for some minutes. Then he walked back to the cottage, where Dora was at the window of her painting room with a brush in her hand, having already begun what he could see, even at a distance. It was going to be a different kind of picture, warmer, somehow, in its preliminary gestures, than the endlessly reworked grey seascapes of recent months. Peter Searle had been at the cottage that afternoon, and Vera Caswell had received him in the sitting-room, with the tea and the collected dignity of a woman who has decided to stop being careful. Poirot had watched this without comment, with a quiet satisfaction that he would not have described as sentimentality, but which resembled it fairly closely. He packed his small valise that evening with the precision he brought to everything, shirts folded to exact dimensions, shoes wrapped in their bags, his supply of the particular tie-seine he required. For morning replenished from the packet Vera had thoughtfully obtained from the Polwydden pharmacy. He carried the valise downstairs and set it by the front door. Mrs. Polly Treen was in the kitchen. He went to say good-bye. She received his thanks with a nod that managed to communicate both acknowledgement and the clear position that she had done nothing that required particular thanks. She had answered his questions honestly, which was simply what one did, and if it had helped, then well and good. Mrs. Treen, Poirot said with genuine warmth, "You are, if I may say so, a woman of considerable character." "I am a woman who has lived 60 years in Cornwall," she replied, which she appeared to regard as the same thing. He said good-bye to Dora, shook his hand with a directness, and looked at him with a gratitude so unadorned that it was more moving than elaborate expression would have been. She pressed upon him a small watercolour sketch, rolled and tied with kitchen string. The lighthouse at evening, the beam just visible, the sea below it silver. He accepted it with unaffected pleasure. Vera Caswell walked with him to the gate. The evening was clear, unusual for this coast, and the lighthouse beam swept the darkness above the sea with its regular, silent authority. They stood for a moment in the gate gap, and Vera said, in a level voice, "The matter of Reginald. Will it be investigated properly?" "I have made a report," Poirot said. "I have passed it to Inspector Morrow, who will pass it to the appropriate persons in London. Cannot promise you what they will find, or what will result. These things are uncertain. But I promise you that the question will be asked, seriously." "That's all I wanted," she said, "to have it asked." "Yes," said Poirot, "that is very often all any of us want." He stepped through the gate and turned back to look at the lighthouse one final time, stood against the evening sky with the particular authority of permanence, a thing that had been there before any of the people now alive in its shadow, and that would continue after them. Its great eye turning, its beam reaching out into the dark water, unreasonably faithful to its function. The hired car came at 8 o'clock. Poirot placed his valise in the boot and got in, and they drove up the cliff road through the blackthorn walls that pressed in on either side. As they reached the top of the cliff and turned toward Polwydden, he looked back once through the rear window. The lighthouse beam was still visible, a white sweep against the darkening sky, circling and returning, with the patient persistence of a thing that has decided to remain visible regardless of what the darkness may prefer. He turned back in his seat and folded his hands in his lap. The little grey cells were quiet now, satisfied, orderly, at rest. The case of Edmund Caswell, keeper of the Dunmorrow Light, was concluded. A man had died at the top of a lighthouse, in the dark, alone with another man, and 19 years of concealed history. The law would attend to what followed. The living would sort out their lives. The living always must. Imperfectly, hopefully, one morning at a time. As for the light, it would keep turning. That, at least, was certain. What? The coast would remain dangerous, and the beam would continue to warn. And ships that might otherwise have come to grief on the rocks below Dunmorrow Point would pass safely in the night. Their crews, unaware of everything that had occurred on that particular promontory, unaware of the dead man, and the document case, and the woman at the garden gate, who had finally, after 8 months, asked the question that needed asking. Hercule Poirot settled into the corner of the hired car and closed his eyes. He was thinking, faintly and contentedly, about Brussels, about a particular restaurant on the Rue des Bouchers, where the carbonade was made as it should be made, and where the waiter never once made the mistake of bringing water before it was requested. He would go there, he thought, when the war was over. He would sit at the corner table and eat his carbonade, and drink the correct glass of Belgian ale, and think of nothing at all that required the little grey cells to exert themselves. It would be, in its quiet way, a complete pleasure. The car turned onto the main road and gathered speed. Dunmorrow fell away behind him, into the dark and the fog and the turning light, into the place where all solved mysteries eventually go. The settled, certain past, from which they cast no further shadow, and need no further attention, and trouble no one any more. Finis,